Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I am Templar, and today for this video on history, I am actually going to be talking about none other than the history of George Washington. Now in truth, I wanted to actually explain this a little while back, especially for the 4th of July. However, with work and such, I was technically a little busy and such like that. Anyways, why don't we get right into it and actually talk about George Washington himself, shall we? Now in truth, many of y'all might understand that George Washington was technically the father of our country, the first president. But in truth, he did not actually ever want to be. And many people I've seen on the pretty much on the internet, on news, are pretty much tearing down his statue and Thomas Jefferson's statue for no damn reason, not even knowing what the hell he fought for. And as well, they only state that he was fighting for slavery, when in truth, they know nothing of history at all. In truth, the story of George Washington is a very complicated and yet very diverse one in truth. As well, he was born to his father Augustine Washington and Mary Bell Washington in February 22nd of 1732 in Pope's Creek, Virginia. It was actually stated that in this timeline he was actually stated to have been only the half-brother to his supposed older brother Lawrence Washington. The family moved to Little Hunting Creek in 1735, then to Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1738. Augustine died in 1743. Washington inherited Ferry Farm and 10 slaves, while his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, actually inherited Little Hunting Farm and then renamed it Mount Vernon. Washington did not actually have a formal education as many people believe, as his older brothers had received in England. But in doing so, it was actually stated that he had learned mathematics and as well trigonometry and as well even land surveying when he was young. He was actually a talented draftsman and including even a very talented mapmaker. But in his early years of adulthood, it was stated that his writing had too much considerable force and precision, and of which it was actually stated that it did not display much wit and as well much humor. In pursuit of admiration, status, and power, it was actually stated that he actually tried to find a better life for himself, and of which it was actually stated that Washington later on visited Mount Vernon in Bevier, the plantation that belonged to Lawrence's father-in-law, William Farrax. Farrax became Washington's patron and surrogate father. Washington spent about a month in 1748 with a team surveying Farrax's property. He received a surveyor's license in the following year from the College of William and Mary, and he thus familiarized himself with the frontier region, resigning from the job in 1750. By 1752, he had almost bought 1,500 acres and owned 2,315 acres. In 1751, Washington made a trip abroad with his brother Lawrence to Barbados, hoping that the climate would cure his brother's tuberculosis. Washington was stated to have contracted smallpox during the trip, which left him immune but left his face slightly scarred. Lawrence died in 1752. Washington leased Mount Vernon from his widow. He inherited it outright after her death in 1761. It was actually stated that due to the fact of Lawrence Washington's service as Adjutant General of the Virginia militia, inspired George Washington to actually seek a commission. Virginia's lieutenant governor at the time appointed him as a major as a commander of one of the 4 militia districts. The British and French were competing to control the Ohio. The British and French were technically trying to compete for the Ohio Valley. At the time, the British building forts along the Ohio River, and the French doing likewise between the river and Lake Erie. In 1753, the Virginian lieutenant governor actually appointed Washington and a special envoy to demand the French to evacuate the territory which the British had claimed. The Virginian lieutenant governor also appointed him to make peace with the Iroquois Confederacy and to gather intelligence about the French forces. Washington met the half-king Tecumseh. However, it was actually stated they were intercepted by a French patrol and escorted to Fort Le Beaufort, where Washington was actually received in a friendly manner. He delivered the British demand to evacuate the French commander, but the French refused to leave. St. Pierre gave Washington an official answer in a sealed envelope after a few days' delay, and he gave Washington's party food, extra winter clothing, and as well a trip back to Virginia. Washington completed the Pierre's mission in 77 days in difficult winter conditions, achieving a measure of distinction when his report was published in Virginia and London. It was then stated in February of 1754 that the Virginian governor at the time actually promoted Washington to lieutenant colonel in the second command of the 300-strong Virginia regiment, with orders to confront the French forces at the forks of the Ohio. It was actually then stated that Washington then left with actually only half the regiment in April, but soon learned that a French force of around 1,000 had begun construction on Fort de Neuss. In May, having set up a defensive position at Great Meadows, he had actually learned the French had actually made camp 7 miles away. He decided to take the offensive. It was actually even stated that the French forces were only about 50 men. So Washington advanced on May of 28 with a small force of Virginians and Indian allies to ambush them, which would later on be known as the Battle of Gentlemanville Glen, or as the Gentlemanville Affair. But it was actually even stated that the French forces were actually killed outright with muskets and hatchets. French commander Joseph Calonne de Gentlemanville, who carried the diplomatic message to the British to evacuate, was actually stated to have been killed. French forces found Gentlemanville and some of his men dead and scalped, assumed Washington was responsible. Washington blamed his translator for not communicating the French intentions. It was actually even stated that Dinwiddie congratulated Washington for the victory over the French. However, this would later on then turn into the French and Indian War sometime later, or in this case in Europe as the 7 Years' War. It was actually stated during his early years he actually took part in many conflicts in the French and Indian War, and of which actually brought many times over of fame and fortune to George Washington. It was actually stated that while fighting in the conflict, George Washington actually stated the following, that all this conflict in which, why was it needed, in which we could have easily dealt with it ourselves. Now, why did Washington supposedly shoot the French? Well, in truth, we don't really know if it was Washington or not. In truth, there are many stories that he actually did not actually commit this type of murderous act, and in truth might have been the French, or in which some say it was something else. However, until it was actually in the time of 1758, it was actually stated that Washington had actually earned a reputation as a great leader, and as well actually of taking many areas under French control, such as none other than Fort de Neuss, and as well actually even stated to have held off against many types of French allies and as well French forces. It was actually stated that in 1759 and 1755, it was actually stated that George Washington then left the military and actually became a wealthy citizen, and as well later on became known as a famous playwright. However, many of his type of stories never got out there and published. So, in truth, we don't really know what they would have actually looked like. It was then later stated that while in his times of his civilianhood, it was actually stated that while being in Mount Vernon, he had actually taken hold on many slaves, and as well had actually tried to free them as many times over. However, due to the fact of the historical types of conflict in the South, he could not actually do so. In fact, it was even stated that he had actually talked with none other than Thomas Jefferson on this issue of how to free slaves and end the idealism of slavery in general in the South, when in truth they both knew that this was never to actually happen in their timeline. It was actually even stated that sometime during his time in history, he had actually met his future wife, Martha Washington. They later on adopted a son known as John Parke Cartetus, or in this case, which would later be known as John Parke Washington. It was then stated that in 1775, it was actually stated that George Washington actually was then asked to become Commander-in-Chief after he had received a message at Mount Vernon. He hastily dispatched himself all the way down to the region of Pennsylvania. It was stated that there he had actually started to meet with many parts of the Congress and actually take part in the type of becoming the Commander-in-Chief of the military. However, his type of role was actually a vote by many people. It was actually stated that he was actually one of the few that were actually asked. One of the others would have actually been White Horse Henry Lee, who of which was one of Washington's aggravated commanders, who later on led massive defeats. It was stated, though, that Washington would never give up on his complete fight for the independence of the Americas, and as well he even took the liberty of taking the siege on Boston in the early months of 1775. It was actually stated that during the Boston siege, it was actually stated that none other than George Washington actually declared that we actually must stay calm and defend ourselves and fight against any forms of tyranny. However, if we do not hold ourselves dear, then in which we ourselves will only destroy it. It was actually later stated that George Washington even took part in the Battle of Long Island, of which it was actually stated that Washington actually managed to proceed to New York City, arriving in April 13th of 1776, and begun constructing fortifications along the said region, hoping to stop the British attack. It was actually stated that this type of plan actually managed to win. However, it still actually demanded massive problems. As well, it was actually then stated that Washington had to retreat and as well withdraw many times over, mainly because many of his commanders, such as General Greene, were actually causing problems for him. And as well, it was actually stated that actually none other than General William Alexander had actually head off the British and gave cover while the army crossed the East River under the darkness to Manhattan Island, without a loss of life. However, General Alexander was captured. It was actually stated that when General Howe had actually taken Long Island at the victory, it was actually stated that, emboldened by his victory at Long Island, General Howe had actually dispatched a message to George Washington asking him for a tranquility of peace, but Washington declined this offer, demanding to be addressed as well as a type of form of history against a tyrannical ideal. It was actually stated that while crossing the Lower River in later on time, it was actually stated that General Washington had actually taken the battle to the British, actually defeating the Hessians at the Battle of Trenton and as well Princeton. It was actually stated that while doing this, it was actually stated that George Washington's famous crossing would later on be remembered in history books as a famous victory, even though it was only a matter of defeat early on. George Washington later on led many campaigns into Brandywine, Garmentown, and as well as Saratoga, winning many victories, but as well also leading many massive defeats, as well loss of casualties. George Washington demanded that Congress actually send more allies and as well supplies to aid them. As well, the countries of France and as well Spain actually started to join George Washington, especially after the Battle of Monmouth, which took place sometime after the Battle of Valley Forge, which, if none other than history books, it was actually stated that during this timeline that George Washington actually stated the following, that of which, if my men cannot actually stand toe to toe with the British, then how are we to stand against them? It was actually even stated that George Washington actually managed to save his men by actually hoping to save them in general. It is even stated that none other than Lafayette, a French commander in history, had actually aided Washington and rushed forth towards America while wearing a dress. It was actually stated that during his time at Valley Forge, many of his men were actually trained to later on take the fight to none other than the British at the Battle of Monmouth. During this time, though, it was actually stated that the British actually were badly beaten and as well forced to retreat. However, it was also during this time at the Battle of Monmouth that it was stated that Charles Lee and Lafayette moved actually with 4,000 men without Washington's knowledge, and of which this actually later on led to a massive routing for Charles Lee when he had actually ordered his men to retreat and withdraw from the area, while James Lafayette held his ground and actually fought back. Washington was infuriated with Charles Lee and actually ordered him to leave the field immediately. Washington was actually even stated to have actually kept fighting up until his timeline, and as well it was even stated that he was even given direct power by Congress, stating that he was given supreme power, near identical to Julius Caesar. However, it was even stated that when he was given this power, that of which I will become a tyrant, and in doing so I will return it back to the people. At which he made his message clear after the war. When it came to the time at the end of the conflict, it was stated that he had returned to Congress and giving them none other than the signing of this type of document, stating, "You have given me power in which that of what I did not need, and of which I myself must give it back to the people. For I am not a conqueror nor a tyrant, but a leader that I am. I fight not for tyranny nor injustice, but of which all men are equal, and of which I hold dear to my own ideals, and of which you, my fellow patriots, shall stand with me against this tyranny." George Washington's speech was so impressive that many congressmen later on wanted him to lead America as a king. But he stated, "No, just let me be. For a king cannot actually rule, nor can it lead. But let the people rule. Let them not become people that have been conquered, but let them be known as patriots beyond measure." After saying these words, it was stated that he returned to Mount Vernon and later on stayed a life there. However, it was actually then stated that he was asked to become President of the United States of America, winning in a landslide. It was stated that becoming president for the first term, it was actually stated that George Washington was hoping to return home after his first term was over. However, he won by a landslide again, in which his party was neither the Federals nor of the Democrat Republicans. It was actually of the Independent Party. The Independent Party was actually one of George Washington's idealisms, which was technically like a third party. He actually stated the following: "What is more great in a nation? A nation of people, free of liberty, free of any injustice, that of which give forms of freedom, all idealisms of liberty. But to get rid of the safe havens, that of which bind us with safety and destruction, I choose to give my nation the liberty of freedom for all, not this injustice of destroying our lives, forcing us to become tyrannical in forms, that of which we must hold dear as nation beyond heaven. We must be of the light in darkness, and hold as we must see. As the first of everything of our situation, to establish and predict the very idealism of liberty." George Washington's words spoke more than anything that of which any American had ever seen or heard before. His words were incredible, and later on presidents such as Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Grant, and including many others later on, actually wrote down and as well rewrit his script, stating that we stand by the whole dear, of which all nations are equal, and all forms of man are equal. But when we do not see it, we are truly damned. That was written by General Grant after the conflict of the American Civil War, trying to reunite the American government, which he took off from none other than George Washington. It was stated that after George Washington actually became President of the United States and then left, it was stated that none other than one of his former rivals that was then preceded by him was none other than John Adams, who of which was actually his own vice president, of which was actually later on stated to have been a great president after him. However, this was stated still to be known. It was actually even stated that George Washington tried to make the Native Americans feel more American to him, and as well actually spoke of many Native American tribes known as the Native American Affairs. One such most famous was actually Chief Saragaway, who of which was Washington's peace emissary from the Western Confederation of the Native American tribes. He had actually bore a type of medal across his neck for so many years and was even stated to have been buried with it. This pendant medal was extremely big, as you can see. This is an incredible part of American history, and in truth, Washington was a really great leader. However, in December 14th of 1799, it was actually stated that George Washington had breathed his last after he had actually passed away. It was stated that his final type of meaning and form, that he had actually died from a type of rare tongue type form, keeping him from actually swallowing his food, causing him to die very slowly. There are many monuments to George Washington to this day, such as the Washington Memorial, and as well many type of currency that actually show his face. But people today, as I can actually tell you to this, you who actually destroy history and do not know it, I dare you to actually try and look at history before you tear it down and learn something from it. In truth, George Washington despised slavery as much as any American. He actually stated the following: "If I had the right to free every slave that of which I could see, I would do so, but sadly I cannot. For this time and era must become far beyond us, an era in which all men are truly equal, an era in which our lives are equal." Those are his words, ladies and gentlemen, when he spoke against an idealism of injustice. It was actually stated that his burial is still in Mount Vernon to this day, and of which is one of America's most famous leaders. George Washington did not want to become a dictator. He did not want to be a slave owner. He wanted peace beyond any. He stated many types of forms, such as common sense by none other than Thomas Paine, as well as many other types of memorable ideals. It was actually stated that on 10 p.m. of December 14th that George Washington spoke his last words. His final words were, "I am just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault unless 3 days after I am dead. Do you understand me?" Now, those words, if now you understand, George Washington wanted people to remember him. He wanted all Americans to come to him so that they can remember and say their final goodbyes to him. It was actually stated that when George Washington died, many times over, America mourned. For 3 days they mourned. Thomas Jefferson even stated the following, "O woe is be to a man of liberty, that of which has fallen before me. A man so boldly ideal with freedom and just, and his eyes of liberty could never die." Thomas Paine even wrote a short story on a newsletter, stating, "To all Americans that once heard his cry, a liberty of shining stars denied, but never fell his heart's content, for liberty beyond all, withhold we stand against." Thomas Paine was wanting people to remember him when he stood against injustice, when he stood against a type of intolerance, that of which all made him whole, that all Americans should stand for liberty and justice. George Washington is one of my favorite presidents in history. In truth, he is actually up there with Theodore Roosevelt and including Abraham Lincoln, and as well with Dwight D. Eisenhower, as well with Thomas Jefferson. Why? Because they stood for something. They stood against an idealism of tyranny, and they stood for equality beyond measure. However, their idealisms actually led them to conflict and as well even destruction of their own country. However, George Washington was one of them who actually was wanting to keep a peace beyond measure. It was even holding dear to the idealism of all men, equal and just. But sadly, many people do not remember it. Many times over, they only forget them, and they only see something that they do not like. I'm telling you this, of all Black Lives Matter and of all Antifa, do not destroy history, but learn from it. Otherwise, you're becoming that of which you are fighting against. You're becoming the socialist idealisms that of which have destroyed nations. You're saying that you are being like what America says. Did you fight for liberty when there was none? Did you give up power when you were given it? No, you did not. You have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, we must learn from the past to make a brighter future. George Washington stated that all men of any nation that are equal under its eyes of the Almighty God give forth a brighter future. But when man does not see this, then we are truly doomed, and in doing so are destroying themselves before them all. I'm Celtic Templar. Please like and subscribe. Also check out our Facebook for more notifications on an upcoming video. As well, guys, hopefully I can catch you all in the next one. If you want me to talk about a famous figure in history, please let me know down in the comments below, or a famous conflict in history. As well, I'll be happy to do so immediately. Anyways, guys, this has been Templar. Have a great day.